Some habits are taught to us. Others are inherited, passed down so quietly that we don't even realize we're carrying them until grief forces us to pick them up ourselves. This is the story of a man who didn't choose to wake up at 5 in the morning because someone convinced him it was the secret to success. He chose it because it was the only way he knew how to sit with his father one last time. What he built afterward, he built almost by accident. Before any of that, John was exactly the kind of person this story shouldn't have been about. He was 27, technically employed at a small electronics repair shop, though employed was generous. John woke up late most mornings, sometimes missing the shop's opening hours entirely, mumbling apologies to a manager who had long since stopped expecting much from him. If a repair job came in that interested him, he'd do it properly. If it didn't, he'd rush through it carelessly, handing devices back half-fixed, already reaching for his phone before the customer had even left. His nights looked worse than his mornings. John stayed up well past 1 or 2 a.m., scrolling through his phone in the dark, video after video. Nothing memorable, nothing that added up to anything the next morning except heavy eyes and a headache. He'd fall asleep with a film still playing, wake up groggy, skip far entirely without a second thought, and repeat the same shapeless day. His father, Rashid, never lectured him about it directly. He simply woke, every single morning without exception, at exactly 5 o'clock, made a single cup of strong tea on the small kitchen stove, prayed quietly by the window, and sat there afterward for 20 minutes before the day officially began. John had grown up hearing that kettle whistle through thin apartment walls his entire life, a sound so constant he'd stopped noticing it completely. Once, half joking, half irritated, he'd asked his father why he bothered getting up so early when nothing required it. "The morning doesn't ask anything of you yet," Rashid had said simply. "That's the only time in the day that's still just yours. If you're willing to claim it before you've already thrown it away scrolling in the dark." John hadn't taken it seriously. Not then. Rashid died suddenly on a Thursday in early spring. A heart attack in his sleep, quiet and without warning, the same quietness with which he'd lived nearly everything. John found him the next morning when he came by to drop off groceries, the small stove untouched, the tea never made. His father's prayer mat still folded neatly by the window from the night before. The days after blurred together. The funeral, the relatives, the paperwork, the strange hollow silence of an apartment that no longer had anyone waking up early inside it. John moved through it all feeling like he was watching someone else's life from slightly outside his own body, ashamed, for reasons he couldn't fully name, of how many mornings he'd slept straight through without a second thought. About 2 weeks after the funeral, unable to sleep, John found himself awake at 5 in the morning without an alarm, staring at the ceiling of his own flat. Almost without deciding to, he got up, made a cup of tea exactly the way he remembered his father making it, too strong, barely any sugar, and sat by his own window, the way he'd watched his father do for nearly 3 decades without ever once joining him. He didn't know why he was doing it. It didn't feel like discipline. It felt like grief looking for somewhere to sit down. Almost as an afterthought, he unrolled his father's prayer mat, still folded by the window exactly where Rashid had left it, and prayed for the first time in longer than he was willing to admit, even to himself. The next morning, he did it again. And the morning after that. It wasn't a decision, exactly. More like a ritual his body seemed to need before his mind had agreed to it. Prayer, 1 cup of tea, 1 window, 1 quiet hour that belonged to no one but him. Exactly the way his father had once described it. At first, John simply sat there afterward, sometimes crying, sometimes just staring at the empty street below, replaying small, ordinary memories he hadn't thought about in years. His father teaching him to hold a screwdriver properly, correcting his grip without ever raising his voice, patient in a way John had never once appreciated while it was happening. Weeks passed. The crying came less often, but the 5 a.m. window remained, and so, unexpectedly, did the prayer. One morning, restless in the silence, John picked up his father's old, battered toolbox, sitting untouched in the corner of the flat since the funeral, and began, almost absent-mindedly, sorting through it. Old manuals, half-finished wiring diagrams, a cracked multimeter his father had clearly meant to replace and never got around to. John found himself reading one of the old manuals slowly, in that same quiet window, simply because it was there, and the silence needed filling with something other than memory. He didn't set out to learn anything. But somewhere in the third week of reading his father's old technical notes, John realized he understood wiring diagrams his father had once tried explaining to him years earlier. Explanations that had gone completely over his head as a distracted, uninterested teenager, now suddenly, quietly making sense. The 20 minutes slowly stretched into an hour, then closer to 2, as John began practicing basic appliance repairs on old, broken devices customers had abandoned at the shop, using techniques from his father's handwritten notes. His manager noticed first, watching him repair a small refrigerator compressor that had been sitting untouched in the back room for weeks. "Where did you learn to fix that?" he asked, genuinely startled. "My father's notes," John said. "I've been reading them in the mornings. Same hour, every day now." Something had clearly shifted in him, not just his skill, but the way he showed up. He stopped rushing through repairs. He stopped reaching for his phone mid-task. Word moved slowly through the shop, then through regular customers who began specifically requesting him whenever anything more complicated than a screen replacement came in. 6 months after the funeral, encouraged by how much he'd absorbed from his father's old notes, John decided to formalize what he'd taught himself. He enrolled in a proper certified electronics and appliance repair course, studying during his early morning hours before work and on his one day off each week. The same discipline that had begun as grief, now quietly becoming genuine ambition. It wasn't easy alongside a full workday. Some mornings, he was still exhausted, still tempted to skip both the studying and the prayer that had become attached to it. But he'd learned, by then, that showing up on the difficult mornings was the entire point, not the easy ones. A year after enrolling, John completed his certification, then a second, more advanced course in industrial and commercial appliance systems, work far beyond what his small neighborhood shop typically handled. 2 years after his father's death, John left the small repair shop, not in frustration, but with real gratitude and his old manager's genuine blessing, and opened a small appliance and electronics repair service of his own, operating out of a modest rented storefront 2 streets from where he'd grown up. It started with just him. Within a year, as demand grew beyond what one person could manage, John hired his first technician, a young man he recognized instantly, someone who reminded him uncomfortably of who he used to be, careless and unfocused, until John gave him the same quiet patience his father had once given him. By the 3rd year, John had a small team of 4 technicians working under him, each trained personally in the same careful, patient methods he'd inherited from a dead man's handwritten notes. He still opened the shop early, still made time each morning for prayer and tea before anyone else arrived, still occasionally caught himself checking his phone too long at night, and made a point of putting it down. One morning, his youngest cousin, Bilal, staying with him temporarily after losing his own job, groggily asked why John always woke up so early, even on days the shop was closed, and why he still bothered praying every single far without exception. John poured a second cup of tea, sliding it across the small table without quite meaning to. "My father used to do this," he said. "I ignored it my entire life. Stayed up scrolling until 2 in the morning, skipped prayer without a second thought, barely took my own work seriously. I only understood any of it after he was gone, that the morning doesn't ask anything of you yet. It's the only part of the day that's still completely yours, before everyone else's needs, and your own bad habit. Take it from you." Bilal, still half asleep, wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "So it's like a discipline thing?" John considered that for a moment. It didn't start as discipline. It started as missing someone and being ashamed of who I'd been while he was alive to see it. The discipline came later, almost by accident, because I kept showing up for a conversation that had already ended, and somewhere along the way, it turned into showing up for myself, and then for 4 other people who depend on me now too. That is the truth this story quietly carries. Not every early morning begins with ambition. Not every disciplined habit starts with a plan, a mentor, or a system written on a napkin. Sometimes, it begins with grief, with shame, with simply needing somewhere quiet to sit and pray before the world demands anything of you. But whatever brings you to that hour, loss, regret, necessity, or simple desperation, what happens inside it is still entirely up to you. John didn't wake up early to build a business or lead a team. He woke up to hold on to his father a little longer, and to finally say the prayers he'd skipped for years. The rest, the courses, the certifications, the small team of technicians who now depend on him, arrived quietly, almost as a side effect, built one ordinary, uneventful morning at a time. Maybe you don't need someone to teach you a system, or a stranger to hand you 3 rules on a card. Maybe you simply need one small, protected hour, for whatever reason first brings you to it, and the willingness to keep showing up, long after the original reason has faded into something steadier. The morning doesn't ask anything of you yet. It's still yours. What you build there is entirely up to you.